Say it again. Those were the first words Naomi Whitaker ever said to Daniel Mercer, and by the time she whispered them across his desk, half the floor had already stopped pretending to work. 10 minutes earlier, Daniel had been doing what he always did every morning, moving through life with the quiet precision of a man who did not have room for mistakes. He had packed Owen's lunch in a brown paper bag, cut the apple slices so they would not turn brown by noon, checked the straps on his son's science fair project twice, and tied the 8-year-old's sneakers while listening to a voicemail from the school about parent arrival times. Owen was spending the afternoon with Daniel's mother until the science fair started, and the apartment had felt too quiet the second the front door clicked shut behind him. So while standing in the elevator at Whitaker Dynamics, balancing a travel mug in one hand and his phone in the other, Daniel typed the message he sent his son almost every week when the world felt too large and the hours between them felt longer than they were. I miss you already. He hit send without looking. Then the elevator doors opened, and the blood drained from his face. The message had not gone to Owen. It had gone to Naomi Whitaker, CEO, top of the company directory, the last person in Boston any sane employee would accidentally text something that personal. Daniel froze in the middle of the lobby traffic, thumb hovering over the screen as if he could pull the words back by force. He could not. By the time he reached his desk on the 7th floor, the read receipt was already there. Then the private elevator opened. Naomi stepped out in a charcoal suit sharp enough to cut glass, her heels quiet against the polished floor, her expression unreadable in that particular way powerful people practiced until it became part of their face. She walked straight past directors, analysts, and assistants, straight past 2 managers who instantly fell silent, and stopped beside Daniel's chair. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile. She leaned down just enough for her perfume to mix with the cold scent of rain from outside, and said, low and controlled, "Say it again." Daniel stood too fast, nearly knocking his chair back. Every screen around him might as well have gone dark. He could feel the whole office leaning in without moving an inch. But what Naomi saw in his face was not flirtation, not arrogance, not some desperate attempt to get noticed. It was fear, real fear, not of embarrassment, of fallout. Because Daniel Mercer was not afraid of looking foolish in front of strangers. He was afraid of losing the one ordinary life he had built carefully enough to keep his son safe. Naomi Whitaker straightened, glanced once at Daniel's phone still clenched in his hand, and said, "Next time, double-check the recipient." That was all. No raised voice. No lecture. No public humiliation from the woman whose approval could move stock prices and whose silence could make an entire floor stop breathing. Then she turned and walked back toward the private elevator as if nothing unusual had happened. That should have ended it. Instead, it made everything worse. Because people could survive a public correction, what they could not survive was ambiguity. By 9:30, the first sideways looks had started. By 10, 2 assistants near the glass conference room stopped talking the second Daniel walked past. By 10:15, a screenshot of the message had somehow found its way into a private group chat that clearly was not staying private. Daniel did what he always did when life tried to turn loud around him. He lowered his head and worked. He answered vendor emails, updated a facility's budget sheet, and rebuilt a damaged reporting file that one of Brett Halpern's managers had broken the night before. But tension had a way of entering a room before words did. Brett arrived just before 11 carrying a tablet and the kind of smile that always looked rehearsed. He stopped beside Daniel's desk, checked the screen in front of him, then said, "Interesting morning, Mercer." Daniel did not look up right away. "Morning, Brett." Brett leaned one hand on the cubicle wall as if they were sharing a joke. "You know, some people spend years trying to get executive visibility. You found a very original shortcut." A few nearby desks went still. Daniel finally lifted his eyes. It was a mistake. Brett's smile did not change. "That is not really what people are saying." Then he walked away, leaving the sentence behind like a stain. Daniel stared at his spreadsheet for a full 5 seconds before the numbers blurred. What bothered him was not Brett. Men like Brett existed in every company. What bothered him was Naomi. She had heard the panic in his voice. She had seen the color leave his face. And still she had chosen silence over clarity. Around noon, Daniel opened a separate file on his desktop, one he had been building for 3 days. It was a brief internal memo about the access control system being used for Family Innovation Night on Friday. The east event floor was still tied to an older failover sequence from before the merger. If the backup order triggered wrong under load, magnetic doors could lock at the wrong time. It was the kind of problem most people ignored because nothing had gone wrong yet. Daniel attached the memo and sent it up the chain. Brett rejected it in under 7 minutes with one line, "Not your lane." Daniel read the response once, then looked across the floor toward the executive wing. For the first time all day, his expression changed. Not embarrassment, not anger, something quieter. The look of a man recognizing that the wrong mistake had just become more dangerous than the first one. That night, Daniel picked Owen up from his mother's house just after 6. The boy came down the front steps with a foam board tucked under one arm and his jacket half-zipped, already talking before he reached the car. He was excited about the science fair, about the little wind sensor they had taped onto the model glider, about whether the judges would understand why the wings had to tilt a certain way. Daniel listened, smiled when he needed to, and kept his eyes on the road more than usual. He was careful with quiet. Children heard more in silence than adults ever admitted. They stopped for grilled cheese and tomato soup at a diner 2 blocks from the school because Owen had decided that nervous stomachs only trusted simple food. Daniel let him dip the sandwich corners into the soup and talk through every detail twice. For 20 minutes, life looked almost ordinary again. Then Owen's face changed. He was staring down at the tablet Daniel had let him use for homework videos. "Dad," he said softly, "why is your name in Maya's group chat?" Daniel felt the question before he understood it. Owen turned the screen around. There it was. A screenshot of the message. "I miss you already." Under it were the kinds of comments adults liked to believe children never saw. Someone had posted that Mr. Mercer must have found a fast way to get promoted. Someone else joked that the cold queen on the top floor had a soft spot after all. Daniel took the tablet gently, but his hand tightened anyway. "Where did you get this?" Owen shrugged, trying to look older than 8. "Maya said her mom showed her, because people from your office were talking about it." He paused, and the next question landed without warning. "Did I get you in trouble because you missed me first?" Daniel looked at his son across the table and felt something in him go very still. That was the moment the story changed. Not when Naomi had leaned over his desk. Not when Brett had smiled at him like a man already enjoying the damage. Here, in a diner booth with a paper napkin, a cup of cooling soup, and a little boy trying to calculate whether being loved had become expensive. Daniel reached across the table and covered Owen's small hand with his own. "No," he said. "You did nothing wrong. Missing your kid is never wrong." Owen nodded, but children always listened to tone more than words, and Daniel knew his voice had carried too much weight. On the way to the school auditorium for setup, Daniel parked in the lower garage beneath Whitaker Dynamics to grab a materials bin he had left in storage. Owen ran ahead a few steps, then stopped beside an old rolled-up emergency map leaning near the wall. "You still keep the red building maps," he said. "The ones you made for when people panic." Daniel's expression changed for half a heartbeat. He moved to pick up the roll too quickly. He did not realize Naomi Whitaker was standing 20 feet away near the service elevator, having just ended a call. She was close enough to hear the child's voice, close enough to catch the word panic, close enough to notice that Daniel was not embarrassed by the old map. He was protective of it. Naomi said nothing. She watched Daniel take the rolled plans from Owen's hands, steady the boy with a light touch at the shoulder, and guide him toward the freight hallway that led to the event floor. For the first time since the text message, something about Daniel Mercer stopped fitting the picture she had built of him. Not because he looked important. He did not. He looked tired, careful, and entirely devoted to the child beside him. But tired men did not usually keep hand-marked emergency schematics in basement storage. And little boys did not casually mention that their fathers made maps for when buildings failed. Naomi should have kept walking. That was what the old version of her would have done. Observe, classify, move on. But the image stayed with her through the next hour. Daniel Mercer standing in a concrete basement with a child at his side and a rolled emergency map in his hand, like it belonged there more than he did on the 7th floor. By 7:30, the family innovation night setup was still running behind. Vendors were late. The East Presentation Hall had not finished syncing its digital access panels, and Brett Halpern was blaming everyone in a polished voice that made incompetence sound like someone else's hobby. Naomi stepped off a call and found Daniel near the side entrance checking a wall-mounted control box with the focused stillness of a man reading a language nobody else saw. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He turned immediately. "Ma'am." She noticed the formal answer, the guarded posture, the way he placed himself half a step so Owen, who was crouched nearby adjusting the wheels on his project cart, stayed behind him without being told. Naomi glanced at the rolled plans under Daniel's arm. "You seem unusually invested in tonight's event." Daniel held her gaze for a second, then gave the kind of honest answer most executives never knew what to do with. "Because the East floor is still tied to the older failover sequence." Naomi said nothing. Daniel continued, calm and precise. "If the backup power cycles out of order under load, the magnetic doors can lock on the wrong phase. It does not look serious at first. It just slows people down in the wrong place. But if families are moving through narrow hallways with children and strollers, slow becomes dangerous fast." Naomi studied him. There was no performance in his tone. No attempt to sound impressive. Just information. "You sent the memo this morning," she said. "Yes. Brett told me it was outside your scope." "It is outside my title," Daniel said. "That is not the same thing." The words landed harder than he seemed to intend. Naomi folded her arms. "Our dashboard is green." Daniel gave the smallest nod, as if he had expected that answer. Dashboards do not always show inherited architecture. This section still carries pre-merger logic. The override order is old. If one small thing goes wrong, the building will follow the older instruction set, not the cleaner one on the screen. For the first time, Naomi felt something she did not like. Uncertainty. Behind Daniel, Owen had gone quiet, watching both adults with the sharp attention children used when they sensed truth was being weighed by people in expensive shoes. Naomi looked past Daniel toward the hall entrance, where staff members were hanging sponsor banners and laughing too loudly to cover the pressure of the evening. She had a board member arriving in 40 minutes, 3 donors on site, and no patience left for improvised warnings from an analyst whose morning had already become a spectacle. So she made the decision powerful people often made when time was short and certainty was cosmetic. She trusted structure over instinct. "We will have facilities monitor it," she said. "That is enough." Daniel's jaw tightened once. "It is not enough." Naomi's eyes cooled. "You have made your point." There was a beat of silence. Then Daniel looked past her toward the East Hall doors, back to Owen, and finally at Naomi again. "If I am wrong," he said quietly, "you lose 10 minutes and a little pride. If I am right, families pay for it." Naomi held his gaze, then stepped aside as if ending a meeting that had never officially existed. "Enjoy the event with your son, Mr. Mercer." She walked away before the expression on his face could follow her. Behind her, she heard nothing. No protest. No apology. Only the faint sound of paper tightening in Daniel's grip as the old red map bent slightly in his hand. Family Innovation Night began the way disasters often did, under soft lights and polished smiles. Parents walked in carrying coffee cups and camera phones. Children rolled poster boards across the carpet and pointed excitedly at robotic arms, solar cars, and neat rows of sponsor banners hanging under the bright ceiling trusses. Owen stood beside his glider display in a navy sweater Daniel had ironed that morning, trying hard to look confident every time another kid passed by. Daniel adjusted the angle of the foam board, smoothed the tape at one corner, and checked the nearest exit sign without seeming to. Naomi Whitaker moved through the room like she belonged to every square foot of it. Board members greeted her. Donors straightened when she approached. Brett Halpern stayed close enough to look useful and far enough to avoid blame if anything slipped. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of event Whitaker dynamics liked to photograph. Smart families, clean branding, controlled success. But Daniel kept noticing small things that did not belong in a room pretending to be safe. One access panel by the east corridor blinked half a beat late. A service door near the secondary display alcove gave a weak click before sealing. One of the temporary battery packs under a demo station was running warmer than it should have. He saw the pattern because he had spent too many years learning that systems failed quietly before they failed in public. Owen tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel looked down and forced a smile that was gentle enough to fool almost anyone except his son. "I am fine, buddy. Stay near your table unless I tell you otherwise." Owen studied him for one more second, then nodded. Across the room, Naomi noticed the exchange. She also noticed that Daniel was not watching the stage, or the donors, or the executives giving rehearsed remarks near the podium. He was watching the walls, the doors, the ceiling corners, the moving lines of people. Then it happened. Not an explosion, not chaos, just a sharp electrical pop from the auxiliary demo section near the East Hall, followed by a burst of startled voices and one thin ribbon of gray smoke curling up from beneath a presentation table. It should have been minor. A brief technical issue. The kind of thing trained staff handled in under a minute. Instead, the room shifted wrong. Emergency tones chirped. The East Hall access system cycled once, twice, then froze. Magnetic locks caught in the wrong order. Parents trying to guide their children toward the wider corridor found one set of doors unresponsive and another narrowing foot traffic into a bottleneck of confusion. Nothing violent happened. That was what made it worse. It was too ordinary at first. People laughed nervously. Then they tried the same doors again. Then children started asking why the hallway was not opening. Daniel was already moving before anyone around him understood the room had changed. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the noise with a force that made adults turn on instinct. Do not crowd the east corridor. Move left. Keep the kids with you. Slow is faster right now. Naomi looked at him from across the hall and felt the blood leave her face in a way she had not felt in years. Because Daniel Mercer was no longer standing there like an overworked analyst who had sent the wrong text to the wrong woman. He was standing there like a man who had seen this exact mistake coming, and like the building itself still remembered his instructions even if nobody else did. Then Daniel's eyes found Owen in the tightening line of families near the frozen doors, and every controlled part of the night suddenly became personal. Daniel did not run toward the frozen doors. He moved with the calm speed of a man who understood that panic multiplied faster than fire. Parents, keep your children with you and step back 3 feet from the east corridor, he said, his voice low, clipped, and impossibly steady. Nobody is trapped if nobody jams the choke point. Something in the way he said it made people listen. Even Brett stopped talking. Daniel crossed to the nearest wall panel, pulled off the magnetic cover with his fingertips, and scanned the diagnostic lights for less than 2 seconds. Then he looked over his shoulder. Naomi, he said, and it was the first time all night he had used her name without title or hesitation. I need the master event tablet and complete access to the old building shell. Naomi was already moving. She handed him the tablet herself, and when their eyes met, there was no trace of the woman who had dismissed him near the hall earlier. There was only recognition, late and sharp and expensive. Daniel opened a buried system layer, entered a command string from memory, then stopped. They stripped the old labels, he said quietly, but they kept the sequence. His fingers moved again, faster now. On the far side of the corridor, Owen stood pressed close to a volunteer and 2 other children, trying to be brave because his father had once told him that brave did not mean unafraid. It meant listening when it mattered. Daniel did not look at his son again right away. That was the hardest part. He treated Owen exactly the way he treated everyone else in danger, by not letting love make him sloppy. When the green bar flashes, open the service route on the left and move in pairs, he called out. Do not rush. The hall is wider than it looks once the second latch drops. Naomi watched him like she was seeing a hidden room in her own company. Daniel was not guessing. He was not improvising under pressure. He was speaking to the building as if he had once taught it how to think. Then the tablet chimed. 1 green bar. A beat later, a second. Somewhere inside the wall, a relay released with a clean metallic click, and the service door to the left slid open 3 inches, then 6, then fully wide. The pressure in the room changed at once. Daniel pointed, directed, adjusted flow, and kept families moving until the bottleneck dissolved into order. Only then did he cross the corridor and scoop Owen into his arms for 1 brief second before setting him down again. You did good, he said. Owen nodded hard, his face pale but steady. Behind them, facility staff finally caught up to the crisis Daniel had already solved. Naomi turned to Brett, whose expression had collapsed into something gray and useless, and said, Get me the archived merger files. All of them. 20 minutes later, in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and overheated circuitry, Naomi stared at the old campus schematics on the screen and felt something colder than embarrassment move through her chest. At the bottom of the original failover architecture, under a logo from the company Whitaker Dynamics had absorbed years ago, was one name she had never been meant to notice: Daniel Mercer. Naomi found Daniel in the first aid room after the last family had been guided downstairs, and the building had settled into the uneasy quiet that followed a close call. Owen was sitting on the paper-covered exam table with a juice box in both hands, his science fair badge still hanging crooked from his sweater. Daniel stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed, not speaking, not pacing, just making sure his son could see him every time he blinked. Naomi stopped in the doorway, and for the first time in years did not know how to enter a room she technically owned. "Owen," she said gently, "how are you feeling?" The boy looked at his father first, then back at her. "Better." Naomi nodded, then turned to Daniel. "May I speak with you?" Daniel glanced at Owen's half-empty juice box. "Only if I can still hear my son." Naomi accepted that without argument. She stepped inside. For a second, all three of them listened to the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then she said the words that should have been enough and were not. "I was wrong." Daniel did not move. Naomi continued anyway, because truth sounded smaller when spoken late. The archived files came up. "You designed the original emergency shell for the east floor. You flagged the sequence. You warned me." Daniel's face did not change. "Yes." Naomi swallowed once. "And I signed the budget revision that kept the older failover logic in place after the merger." This time the silence was worse, because she had said out loud what had been pressing against her ribs ever since she saw his name on the old plans. Daniel looked down for one brief second, then back at her. "That matters less to me than what happened after I told you." Naomi took the hit because she deserved it. "I know." Daniel's voice stayed level, but something under the calm had hardened. "Do you?" he asked. "Because this was never about a bad text message. It was never about office gossip. It was about the fact that I told you families could pay for a blind spot in your system, and your first instinct was to trust a dashboard over the person standing in front of you." Naomi had faced boards, lawsuits, hostile investors, and reporters with questions sharpened for headlines. None of them had made her feel as exposed as one quiet man refusing to raise his voice. "I should have listened," she said. Daniel nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a basic fact. "You should have listened because the warning was sound. Not because I turned out to be useful. Not because my son was on that floor. Because it was sound." On the exam table, Owen lowered the juice box slowly. He had been trying to be invisible the way children did when adults were talking around pain. Then he looked at Naomi and asked, in a small voice that somehow made the room smaller too, "If my dad sounded important, would you have listened sooner?" Naomi turned to him and had no polished answer, no executive phrasing, no safe distance left. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, and when he opened them, Naomi realized the truth was worse than she had first understood. He had not hidden here because he was less than what he had been. He had stepped down on purpose. He had chosen a smaller title so his son would not have to grow up learning his father through airport pickups and missed bedtimes. And Whitaker Dynamics, under her leadership, had mistaken sacrifice for insignificance. The next morning, Whitaker Dynamics felt different in the way a building feels different after almost failing the people inside it. Nobody said it out loud, but the air had lost its certainty. Naomi Whitaker walked into the board briefing at 8 sharp, carrying a slim black folder and none of the usual insulation that came with power. Brett Halpern was already seated, speaking too quickly to legal and operations as if speed could rebuild authority. Naomi did not sit until the room had gone quiet. Then she placed the folder on the table and said, "Before we discuss optics, donors, or liability language, we are going to discuss responsibility." The sentence landed like a locked door. She did not soften it. She stated that an internal safety concern had been raised in advance and improperly dismissed. She stated that an archived infrastructure layer had been left in place under a cost-saving revision approved at the executive level. She stated that an employee warning had been ignored because it came from outside the people this company had trained itself to take seriously. Brett tried once to interrupt. Naomi turned to him with a look so controlled it left no room for survival inside it. "You rejected a valid warning with the words 'not your lane,'" she said. "You will not speak over this one." By 9:30, internal audit had copies of the screenshot leak. Human Resources had opened a formal investigation into the gossip chain, and security compliance had been ordered to rebuild the entire East Floor sequence from the shell up. People on the 7th floor began learning the oldest lesson in every company: too late. The truth did not become less true because the wrong person said it quietly. Daniel arrived just before 10 with Owen's backpack slung over one shoulder because school had a delayed opening after the overnight electrical inspection. He stepped off the elevator expecting stairs and got something worse instead. Space. Respectful, uneasy space. Conversation stopped not out of mockery now, but because everyone suddenly knew they had been measuring him with the wrong ruler. Naomi met him near the glass conference room. Alone this time, no audience, no theater. "I am restoring your access immediately," she said, "and I want to offer you a formal role leading the safety architecture review." Daniel looked at her, then at the badge she had already had reactivated in executive clearance colors, then back at Owen standing beside him in a puffy blue coat with one shoelace half undone. "That role would mean nights," Daniel said. "Travel." Naomi did not answer because the truth was already there between them. Daniel crouched and fixed Owen's shoelace first. Only after he stood again did he finish the thought. "I already know I can do the work." His voice stayed calm. "The question is what it would cost my son for me to prove it to everyone else." Naomi had spent years believing the highest form of value was visibility. Promotions. Titles. The right room. The right table. The right authority. Standing in front of Daniel Mercer, she understood for the first time that some men stepped away from bigger lives not because they could not hold them, but because someone smaller needed both of their hands. "You would not need to prove anything," she said quietly. Daniel's expression did not soften. "That is where you are still wrong," he said. "At this company, people like me always have to prove it twice." Owen looked up at Naomi with the clear, direct gaze children used when adults had exhausted all their polished lies. "Does my dad have to be important again for people to be nice to him?" Naomi had negotiated mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had never struggled more to answer a question, because the child was not asking about policy. He was asking what kind of world this was. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi Whitaker had no clean way to defend the one she had built. 3 days later, Naomi Whitaker stood in the back of the elementary school gym with no camera crew, no assistant, and no speech prepared, while Owen Mercer adjusted the paper wings on his glider for the final round of the science fair. She had come alone, carrying nothing except a folded copy of the cost revision she had signed months earlier, the one that had kept the old failover sequence in place. Daniel noticed her the moment she stepped through the double doors, but he did not wave. He only rested one hand on Owen's shoulder and kept his eyes on the boy, as if refusing to let any adult conversation become larger than the child who had earned this day. When Owen's name was called for a special design mention, he smiled in that careful way children did when they were proud, but still checking whether it was safe to be. Naomi watched Daniel kneel beside him, straighten his badge, and whisper something that made the boy nod like courage had just been handed back to him in plain English. After the applause faded, Naomi crossed the gym floor and stopped in front of them. She did not start with an excuse. She held out the folded document and said, "This is the decision that should have been challenged, and I signed it anyway." Owen looked at the paper, then at her face. Daniel said nothing. Naomi lowered her voice. "Your father warned me before anything went wrong. I should have listened when the warning was still only a warning." Owen took that in with the serious silence children had when they knew an adult was finally telling the truth. Then he asked the question Daniel had probably been asking himself for days. "If my dad stays, are people going to respect him because he was right, or because they are scared he might leave?" Naomi opened her mouth, but no answer came fast enough to be honest. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and the distance in his eyes was not anger anymore. It was harder than that. It was judgment still in progress. Naomi turned to him and asked the only question left that was not polished into something safer. "If I ask you to stay, would that be for the company, or would that only prove I did not see you until I needed you?" Daniel glanced down at Owen, then back at Naomi, and for the first time she understood that the future of Whitaker Dynamics might not depend on whether he could fix its systems. It might depend on whether he believed the people inside it deserved another chance. Owen held his glider against his chest and looked from one adult to the other. "So what happens now?" he asked. Nobody answered right away. The gym buzzed around them with folding chairs, proud parents, and children carrying projects made out of cardboard and hope. But inside that small circle, everything had gone still. Daniel had a son who needed stability. Naomi had a company built on blind spots she could no longer pretend not to see. And somewhere between them sat a question neither power nor sacrifice could solve cleanly. If a man has already given up the bigger life once to protect his child, should he trust the same world that overlooked him to deserve him now?